Welcome to our World Religions class, part three. We're actually in our second week of our discussion of Hinduism. Last time we talked about the Indus River Valley and the civilization there. That period ran from, well, before 2000 BC up till about 1500 BC. We don't know a whole lot about the religion or the social structure or the politics of this early civilization, and we really don't know the language. But we have discovered seals of jars that have been found with what looks like script on them. It hasn't been deciphered successfully, and some scholars now question whether or not it is even, in fact, script. Um, that's still a discussion. The religion in the Indus River Valley seems to have involved temple rituals and ritual bathing in the great bath found at Mohenjo-Daro. And there seems to be some evidence of animal sacrifice in Kalibangan. Um, there are a number of terracotta figurines that have been found, perhaps some goddess images, and a seal depicting a seated figure surrounded by animals that some scholars thought to be a prototype of the Hindu god Shiva. Others have disputed this, pointing out that it bears a close resemblance to Elamite seals depicting seated bulls. Um, well, there may be many continuities between the Indus River Valley civilization and later Hinduism because of the emphasis that we find on bathing rituals, sacrifices, and goddess worship. But ritual purity, sacrifice, and an emphasis on fertility were really common among every ancient religion, really. So we now move on to the Vedic period, that period from 1500 BC to 500 BC, 1,000 years. And there were two major theories about the development of the early South Asian tradition. The Aryans, word meaning noble ones, had migrated into the Indian subcontinent and became the dominant cultural force there. Hinduism, according to this view, derives from their religion as recorded in the Veda, along with elements of indigenous traditions that they encountered along the way. Then another theory is that this cultural transformation, that Aryan culture is a development of the Indus River Valley culture. On this view, there were no Aryan migrations or invasions, and the Indus Valley culture was already an Aryan or Vedic culture. Talking about this period and how we can know anything about this period, well, it comes from two major sources. That is language and archaeology. And we can make some comments about them. Firstly, the language of Vedic culture was Sanskrit, Vedic Sanskrit, which is related to other languages in the Indo-European language family, which helps to talk about an Aryan migration from the area that we now call Europe. This suggests that the Indo-European speakers had a common linguistic origin known by scholars as the Proto-Indo-European language. Before the Indo-European family of languages had developed, this Proto-Indo-European language was to be found. And to look at language and to look at the words that are being used by any culture tells us a lot about the culture. when I was teaching a class one time on the Mesopotamian culture, I gave the students a glossary of Akkadian. And I said, okay, what can you tell me based on just the words that they use? What can you tell me about Akkad? Well, when they came back, they were like, goodness, these people were warlike. I said, absolutely. The first conqueror was Sargon the Great, an Akkadian. He was the first conqueror that we know of. And so Akkadian has a lot of words for conflict and war and battle and skirmish, and about as many as we do. There's also a lot of words for spear. There was a lot of words for marsh or swamp, and for those reeds, bulrushes that grow on the marshes and riverbanks. And so they said, so they must have lived in a marshy culture. Absolutely. They lived along the river. So just by looking at the words in a language, it tells us what was a part of their everyday life, what motivated them, what did they encounter. That helps a lot in looking at Sanskrit and where those words come from and where the language develops and how closely related it is to so many other languages. Well, then there's also the archaeological continuity in the subcontinent, dating all the way back to the Neolithic, New Stone Age period. And the history of this period is, really pretty complex. One of the key problems is that there are no horse remains that have been found in the Indus Valley. And yet, in the Veda, horse sacrifice is essential. It's absolutely central. So the debate is going on about that. So when we look at the Vedic religion, if we take the Vedic period to refer to the period when the Vedas were composed, we can say that early Vedic religion centered around the sacrifice and sharing the sacrificial meal with each other, and regarding the many gods or devas. That's Devas. The term sacrifice, the word is both homa and yajna, is not confined to offering animals, but it really refers even more widely to an offering into the sacrificed fire, the sacred fire. And whatever they threw into that fire as a sacrifice was important. They threw in milk, for crying out loud, and clarified butter. Well, you start throwing in butter, you're talking about not only the milk that is valuable, but also the effort that goes into making milk. That becomes a part of the sacrifice as well. Some of the Vedic rituals were very elaborate, and they even continue to the present day. Sacrifice was offered to the different Vedic gods, the Devas, who lived in different realms of the hierarchical universe, divided into three, as always, three broad realms. There was the earth, then there was the atmosphere, and then there was the sky. We look at so many of the cultures that will divide the universe, their universe, into three levels. In Hebrew mythology, there is the dome above which God dwells. Then there is the earth upon which humanity dwells. And then there is the water, the primordial water beneath the land. They believed that the land was like a table that floated on the waters, and there was the primordial waters below. Then there was the dome above that, all three levels. In Norse mythology, famous, we have Asgard on top, Midgard second, and then below is Niflheim, where the wicked dead, or let me say, the non-heroic dead are housed in an afterlife. and all kinds of evil creatures down below there. So Vedic religion was much the same. There's the three realms of earth, atmosphere, and then sky or heavens. The earth was the realm of the plant god Soma. There was the fire god Agni, and there was the god of priestly power, who is Braspati. The atmosphere contained the warrior god Indra, the wind god Vayu, and the storm gods, or Maruts. And then there was the terrible Rudra. Then the sky contains the sky god Dios, and who's kind of like the same as Zeus. Um, the lord of cosmic law, Varuna, his friend and god of the night, Mitra, and there was the nourisher, Pushan, and the pervader, Vishnu. Um, all of these begin to really take root in this early Vedic period. In this Vedic period, too, we wind up having some of the most ancient religious texts being composed, which define truth for the Hindus. The Vedas, they got their present form really between 1200 and 200 BC, and were introduced to India by the Aryans. Hindus believe that their texts were received by direct revelation from God, and then was passed on to next generations by word of mouth. Then the Vedic texts, which are sometimes called Shruti, which means hearing, begin to be transmitted, passed on, and for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, the texts were passed on orally. So in the Vedas, the Vedas being those earliest competitions, the Vedas themselves are made up of 4 composition, and each Veda in turn has 4 parts which are arranged chronologically. For example, the first of the Vedas is the Samhitas, and they were the most ancient part of the Vedas, consisting of hymns and praise to God. And when we talk about God, in Hinduism, they only believe in one God. Now, we can name 33,000 or 33 million, however many gods, but they will be quick to tell you, no, 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 those are simply manifestations of the one God, that it takes 33 million descriptions to really begin to approach the magnificence of God, whom they call Brahman. Brahman is existence. So in the Samhitas, for example, now that will be broken up into 4 parts. The Rig Veda of the Samhita, which was composed somewhere around 1200 BC, and that's the oldest of the 4 Vedas, and consists of 1028 hymns praising God. Then there's Yajurveda in the Samhita, and it's used as kind of a handbook by priests for performing the Vedic sacrifices. The third one is the Samaveda, and it consists of the chants and the tunes for singing at the sacrifices, much like in the book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible. There will be chants of thanksgiving and psalms of praise, and in many of them, they will have attached to it a certain mode or certain style of intonation that is passed on to the priest who will do the chanting of it. So Samaveda is much like that. The fourth section of the Samhitas is the Atharva Veda, which is composed around 900 BC and preserves many traditions which actually predate the Aryan influence, and it consists of some of the more primitive rituals like spells and charms and magical chants and formulas. Then, after the Samhitas, you have the Brahmanas, which are rituals and prayers that are to guide the priests in their duties. The Aranyakas concern worship and meditation. And finally, the Upanishads consist of the mystical and philosophical teachings of Hinduism. Um, when we look at the Upanishads, for example, the Upanishads were so called because they were taught to those who sat down beside their teachers. So Upa means near, ni down, shad means to sit. Upanishad, to sit down near. Those texts were developed from the Vedic tradition, but largely reshaped Hinduism by providing the believers with philosophical knowledge. The major Upanishads were largely composed between 800 and 200 BC. They're partly prose, partly verse. Later Upanishads continued to be composed right down to the 16th century. Originally, they were in oral form. The early Upanishads are concerned with understanding the sacrificial rites, and central to the Upanishads is the concept of Brahman, the sacred power which informs reality. And while the priests, the Brahmins, had previously been the ones who, through ritual and sacrifice, had restricted access to the divine, now the knowledge of the universe was open to those of the high and middle estates, castes, who were willing to learn from a teacher. So after the Vedic period, we then move into the epic or Puranic or classical age. This will span 500 BC to 500 Common Era or AD. Again, 1,000 years. This period actually began around the time of the Buddha. And it saw the composition of even more texts. During this time, the Dharma Sutras, the Kshatras, and the two epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were composed. And following them, the Puranas, containing many of the stories that are still popular today. And of course, the most famous, the Bhagavad Gita, part of the Mahabharata. The idea of Dharma develops, Dharma being the law, the duty, the truth of our own caste, of our own life. And sometimes we should say that the Dharma becomes central to Hinduism. And it was expressed in a genre of texts known as the Dharma Sutras, Dharma sermons, and the Shastras. The Dharma Sutras recognize three sources of Dharma. How do we get this truth? Well, there's revelation, that is the Vedas. There's tradition, the Smriti, and there is good custom. Think of ethics. The laws of Manu will then add what is pleasing to oneself. That's the source of the truth. Almost like the golden rule. Do to others what is pleasing to oneself. Sounds a lot like Jesus saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or Rabbi Hillel saying, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. During this period, the Vedic fire sacrifice is minimized. It begins losing in its importance with the development of devotional worship, puja. The devotional worship to images of deities in the temples that becomes sacrifice diminishes, personal worship and devotion increases. The rise of the Gupta Empire, which dates from like 350 to 500 of the Common Era, also saw the development of the great traditions of Vaishnavism, who focused on the god Vishnu, and Shaivaism, which focused on Shiva, and Shaktism, who focused on Devi, Devi. We'll talk about those three in a minute. From this period, we can recognize many elements that are present in today's Hinduism, such as bhakti, devotion, and temple worship. This period saw the development of poetic literature, and these texts were composed in Sanskrit, gorgeous language. And this became really the most important element in this shared culture, these magnificent writings of the time. So we look at some of those gods that we just mentioned, and the Hindus worship, like I said, one God, but in many manifestations. Brahman is the one God, but then there are all these revelations in different forms of Brahman in more specific characteristics. Some of the most important characteristics after Brahman, who is the God who is all existence, responsible for the creation of the world and all living things. But then there's Vishnu. Vishnu is the God that preserves and protects the universe. Vishnu becomes a very important and very intimate God for so many. The Vaishnavites would refer to Vishnu as Ishwara, which means my Lord. So it's something that's very, very dear and very close. My Lord, my Lord. Ishwara is a great word to describe their devotion to Vishnu. Then there is Shiva, who is the god that destroys the universe in order to recreate it. Seems funny to worship a god who is a destroyer, and yet it's destruction with a purpose. As I told you last time, I think the Hindus view 4 ages of the universe or humanity. The first was the golden age, of course, when everything was wonderful and people were devout and people were good to each other. And then there comes the silver age, which is still good, but things fall away a little bit. Then there's the copper age, a further falling away. And then there's the iron age, or the dark age, when cruelty and selfishness, hypocrisy, all of that tends to dominate that age. And so when that age gets to be so bad, then in Shaivaism, they began to call for Shiva in his mercy to destroy the world and let it be recreated by Brahma again. Shiva, the destroyer, his consort is Kali, Ma Kali, and Kali is the goddess of motherhood, but she's also a pretty vicious one. And she is always seen right alongside Shiva. Then there's Devi, Devi, the goddess that fights to restore the Dharma in our individual lives, but also the Dharma of the world as well. Then there's Krishna, Krishna got to be a favorite. Krishna is the god of compassion and the god of tenderness and love. And Krishna is always associated with being young and being energetic and playing a flute. In fact, in George Harrison's songs, George Harrison, formerly of the Beatles, who had become a student of Hinduism, when he would compose songs that would mention Krishna, he would always have a flute trill in the background. It's charming. Then there was Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth and purity. Seems a little incongruous, but okay. And then there was Saraswati, the goddess of learning. And of course, as things go on and move forward, and personal devotion and personal learning becomes so important, then Saraswati becomes a very important goddess for being, what do I want to say, studied and followed. So during this whole period, then, this classical age, this 1,000-year period, the great literature is being written, and we have in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, even smaller works that come out of there. For example, the Bhagavad Gita, which is this great story about Dharma. In the story, Arjuna is a prince. He's a part of this noble caste, and he's standing on his chariot, and his chariot driver is none other than Krishna in disguise. Arjuna begins to think about this, and he says, I don't want to go to war. I don't want to kill anybody. I don't want to be in danger of dying. I don't want to see, my soldiers dying. Why do I have to do this? And the whole discussion is about duty and following our life. And finally, Krishna, in disguise, tells Arjuna, you have to do it. It's your dharma. And there it is. Kind of fatalistic, but not quite. It's not in the sense of fatalistic that you don't have any control over it. It's fatalistic in the sense of this is the duty that has been assigned to you, and you must follow it. Well, to follow it means to build up good karma. And good karma is what is going to help you in your rebirth, your reincarnation. Because remember, the Hindus are strongly believing in reincarnation, and that we're all trapped in the wheel of rebirth called samsara. What they actually want is to be released from samsara, released from rebirth, to not be reborn. So what they're looking for is nirvana. Nirvana isn't paradise, not in the sense that Westerners think of it. It's not heaven. It simply means blissful annihilation. It's like this. When a person is reborn in reincarnation, do you retain any memories, any thought of the life you lived before? Well, no. No, that's not the way they believe. What they believe is it's kind of like passing a flame from one candle to the next. That as you have a lit candle and it passes its flame to the next, then this is you being passed on. Your, what the Buddhists would later call the unconscious life continuum. Not any conscious life, but this is basically your life force. So it gets passed from, so to say, candle to candle to candle. What they eventually want then is that at some point, like a candle, you are blown out. Blissful annihilation. You simply cease to exist. You're no longer caught on the wheel of rebirth, caught in the wheel of suffering. There's finally release from it. That's what they're looking for. And that's what the Buddha later on will build on in the discussion of Buddhism and seeking for nirvana through meditation and all the other things. So that we'll pause there and come back next time and talk about some of the key Hindu beliefs and some of their symbols as well, and uh, and go on to talk about some more of their writings and their places of worship, and talk about that really important system called the caste system, where you're born, the station in life in which you were born. We'll talk about some of their holidays, and then go on to talk about the medieval period, and the pre-modern period and the British period and so on. And talk about some of the reformers, and they definitely had some. So lots to go. Good stuff.